Hi, everyone. So what I thought we'd talk about today is the environment rating scales. And I think we're going to go into, for you guys, it'll be the ITERs, when they mention much of the day and how it relates to accessibility of materials and learning centers and those kinds of things. I think because our previous meeting, we discussed scoring, I think this is the next logical step when we're talking about that gateway, simply because much of the day affects scoring and your assessment so very much. So that's what we're gonna do. And sorry, I'm gonna use a short PowerPoint and kind of get into it with you that way. Okay, so when we're talking about much of the day, the slang for it in ITER's terms is MOD. And what it means is most of the time that children are awake and able to play. So that means most of the time, most of the day, much of the day. And that's the times of the day other than when they're involved in routines like feeding and sleeping and diaper changing, those kinds of things. But for the most of the rest of the time, that would be considered much of the day. One of the things that you have to be aware of when we're talking about much of the day with children is that children are not prevented from using materials for long periods of time, especially if routines are taking overly long, or they're in groups that they're not engaged in play, or they're being kept in areas where access is not possible. And when we're talking about those areas, we're talking about putting them in a swing for a long period of time, or in a bouncy seat, or in their crib when they're awake, and not taking a long time with routines. For instance, sitting at the table for long periods of time while they're waiting for lunch, or waiting for your attention. So awake and able to play. So when we're talking about the amount of time, and this is especially during the assessment, but it's a good rule of thumb for you to remember at any time, is that children cannot be prevented from using materials for more than 20 minutes during any 3-hour observation period. So, and what that means is any one child. So if you, during that 3-hour observation period, and this 3 hours could be at any point of the day, a child spends 10 minutes in a bouncy seat, and then they play for a little while, and then they spend 5 minutes sitting at a table doing nothing. That's going to tack on to that 10 minutes of previous time, which is 15 minutes. And then if you put them in the bouncy seat again, or you put them in a Bumby seat, or those plastic seats, whatever they call those, anytime they're placed somewhere and they're prevented from using materials, then that's going to count during that 20-minute time. Now, a wait of less than 3 minutes is acceptable. So if you do seat kids at the table and they're waiting for lunch, anything less than 3 minutes is fine, but you don't ever want to go over that 3 minutes. That's a rule of thumb for everyone. Much of the day is defined by the authors on page 6 of the ITERs are. And if you want to earn credit for any indicator that mentions much of the day, or MOD, that means children must have access to the specific materials, spaces, or activities that are described in the indicator for no less than 20 minutes during a 3-hour observation period. And the concept of much of the day, MOD, affects 9 different items in your ITERS scale. So it's really important that we remember to use that scale to guide how you provide developmentally appropriate experiences for children's learning. And those 9 different items can affect your score 9 different times. We're going to talk about those too. So these are the areas that fall under much of the day. And you're going to get this handout. I'm going to email this to you as well. And these are the 9 areas that it falls under. So we're going to cover these, and we're going to cover exactly where the scoring is. And remember, from what we talked about before, your scoring is based on all of these items individually and then averaged. Okay. Oops. Sorry, we keep going into the same. Okay, when we're talking about much of the day, we are talking about accessibility. And that means each child's access to materials and activities. When I say each child, that means every child has to have access. If the majority of the class gets access for much of the day and that one child doesn't, then that affects your score, because the scores are meant for every child to have the high quality that the environment rating scale requires. So to determine whether materials are accessible, we've got to consider these factors. The children have to be able to reach them and are allowed to use them, the materials, the toys, the furnishings, and other equipment. So that means if toys are on open shelves, they must be within easy reach of the children. If it's up too high, they can't reach it. It's not going to be considered accessible. It should have no barriers to prevent children from reaching them. And that usually at this age might include a container with a lid that a young child or an infant can't open on their own. And a good rule of thumb is just to remember, if they can't reach it, unlock it, or open it, it's not going to be considered accessible. There are 9 areas in the ITERS-R that are affected by accessibility, and this is where your scoring comes in, and we'll talk about that kind of as we go through it. The first area is number 3, which is page 14 in your book, your provision for relaxation and comfort. And that refers to generally your cozy area or any other area where there's softness provided other than cribs, playpens, those kinds of things. It affects you under that item number 3. It's in area number 3 under 3 different items. So it's 3.2, that's where it comes up first, and it says 3 or more soft toys accessible much of the day. Item 5.1, special cozy area accessible much of the day. And 5.3, many soft toys accessible much of the day. So remember our first meeting, and we talked about how the scoring worked, and you have to score a yes for everything in one column to move to the next column. So this is where it can hit you pretty severely. So if you get a no in that 3.2 and they do not have access to 3 or more soft toys for much of the day, your scoring stops in that column. And that means the most you're going to be able to score is a 2 or potentially a 1. And you don't want that to happen. And then again, with the special cozy area, if they don't have access to the cozy area for much of the day. Or 5.3, many soft toys accessible much of the day. So that could potentially be a pretty low score. Remember, if even one child doesn't have that accessibility. The next area where it talks about accessibility is number 14, using books, and that's page 34. And it starts under 3.1, and then it goes to 5.1. At least 6 appropriate infant toddler books, accessible daily much of the day, or for 5, at least 12 appropriate infant toddler books accessible daily for much of the day. Again, potential there for a low score if they don't have that accessibility. Number 15 on page 35 of your ITERS book is your fine motor, your manipulatives, things that the children pick up with their hands. Again, falls under the 3 column, 3.2. Are these materials accessible for much of the day? You want that answer to be a yes. 5.1, do they have many and varied appropriate fine motor materials accessible for much of the day? Some of these we're going to go into a little more later because you probably have questions about about the many and the varied and those kinds of things. But for today's visit, we're really only discussing the much of the day, the MOD. Number 16, active physical play. That's on page 36 of your ITERS R, and that hits you 3.1. Again, open space provided indoors for active physical play much of the day. So be sure that they have a lot of room for that active physical play. Number 18, music and movement. That's on page 39 of your ITERS R. And that hits you under a 5 column. A little better, but you still want to make sure you hit that yes, because if you don't, your potential highest score possible would be a 4 or even a 3. So, and that's many pleasant sounding musical toys and or instruments accessible daily for much of the day. Number 19, blocks, page 40 in your ITERS. They do have to have accessibility much of the day. A 5.1 to have any accessibility at all. A 5.1 to have at least 2 sets of different types accessible daily for much of the day. 7.1, at least 3 sets of different types accessible daily for much of the day. Okay. Now, when we're talking about blocks, we'll probably talk a little bit later about who has to have blocks, because blocks only have to be this way for children. If you have any child in your classroom at 12 months of age or older, it doesn't affect so much your younger babies. But if you have even one child that's 12 months in your room, then you do want to make sure that you have the blocks and accessories accessible. Number 20, dramatic play. Page 41 in your ITERS, a 3.2, materials accessible daily for much of the day. So dramatic play, that would be your baby dolls, your toy dishes, your telephone, your toy telephone, those types of things. Number 26, peer interaction. Page 47 of your ITERS are peer interaction, the interaction for the children to have that interaction with each other. That needs to be possible for much of the day. And number 30, free play. Are they able to have free play for much of the day? And that's indoors and outdoors, weather permitting. When you're thinking of free play, you got to think they've got to be on the floor, able to play, able to interact with each other. If they're stuck somewhere in a bouncy seat, in a high chair, in their crib, awake, anything like that, it's not going to be considered free play because they have no choice but to be there where you place them. Okay, so those are the 9 areas that we're talking about. And remember, you don't want to get hit with a score of 2 or even a score of 3 in 9 areas because you only have 39 items in your ITERS-R, and that will take a lot uh, of scores. That'll take a big chunk of your score and give you a potential pretty low score. So that's it. That's what we're doing when we're talking about MOD, much of the day, and accessibility. I hope this helps.